There's weariness and an idea and definitely a view that the Vietnam's a country that doesn't want to have to be made to take sides. There's a lot of policymakers who sort of envision Southeast Asia as part of like a grand game. But the Southeast Asian countries don't see it that way. They see we have a relationship with China and a dependence on China for certain activities and a dependence on the US. And their best goal is to continue to triangulate within that space.
This year marks 30 years of diplomatic relations between the United States and Vietnam. In 2023, the two countries upgraded their ties to a comprehensive strategic partnership. But on April 2nd, the US imposed a sweeping 46% tariff on all Vietnamese imports, one of the highest in the world. Days later, a 90-day pause was announced, offering a brief window for negotiation, but the message is clear. Vietnam, once seen as central to US efforts to diversify away from China, is now feeling the squeeze of great power competition. How will Vietnam adapt to this shifting landscape?
Vietnam's current general secretary has said that he wants Vietnam to grow at over 8% this year, with doubling down on that export-oriented strategy, with the explicit goal of connecting Vietnamese private companies more directly to these foreign supply chains.
What's next for U.S.-Vietnam economic ties? And what does this moment mean for American business, regional stability, and the global order?
The U.S. is extremely important to Vietnam, so 30% of Vietnam's exports go to the U.S. Vietnam has lifted itself out of poverty with a strategy of export orientation.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, Vietnam, U.S.-China rivalry, and the new era of tariffs. Today, we're joined by Professor Edmund Milewski, a leading scholar in Vietnam's political economy, professor of political economy in the Department of Political Science, and director of the Duke Center for International Development at Duke University. Moderating the conversation is James Upton.
Well, Professor Milewski, just adding my thanks for your time this evening and appreciate your expertise. And maybe that's a good place to start. My own experience with Vietnam goes back to my years at Morgan Stanley Investment Management when we launched a frontier fund, and Vietnam was always the darling of that fund. In fact, we can talk about this over the course of our conversation, but it often traded at a premium because it was so desired by foreign investors. But I think a nice starting point, considering this is the 30th year or the 30th anniversary of diplomatic relations between the country, is to start with your own journey in the country. When you first went, what brought you there? And maybe the arc, because I understand from our conversation, you go there multiple times a year, the changes you've seen over those 30 years or so.
Yeah. It's a great question. And my journey in Vietnam is almost as long as the U.S. relationship with Vietnam. The first time I came there was in 1997. I was a loose scholar, not a scholar on the loose. My parents always get confused about that, but this is a scholarship that the Henry Luce Foundation gives to young people to go live in an Asian country. I was one of the first loose scholars to actually go to Vietnam. And they placed me at the first business school, which was in Hanoi, and it was a Swedish development project. It actually, in many ways, sort of it's like I'm still influenced by that fellowship today. I took classes at National Economics University, and many of my friends, my student, like soccer team players and fellow students that I was taking classes with at National Economics University, have now gone on to bigger and better things in Vietnamese government and business, and I often call on them a lot when I need advice and help. During that time, when I was there, one of the professors that was working there was a former Bain consultant, and he was trying to start a consulting business in Vietnam. And when he learned that I had taken statistics and econometrics as an undergrad, he decided that he could sell it. And so he developed a course on survey marketing research for businesses that he sold to state-owned enterprises. And he sent me around the country with another young Vietnamese student who went on to become one of Vietnam's most important economists, a guy named Nguyen Van Thang. And we went around and to all these different state-owned enterprises and taught them how to do surveys and collected data. I think about it because at that time that he asked me to do that, I wasn't very good at statistics. I had to learn how to do it so I could teach the class. But it taught me so much about Vietnam and things that have influenced me a lot. I think Brian was talking about this index, the Provincial Competitiveness Index. That is a survey of businesses all over the country. And the key piece of that is that the business environments across Vietnam are so different. And that's one of the things I learned from that experience as a loose scholar that I took with me. I came back to Vietnam, many years, but 2001 and then 2004, I came back and I was working on my dissertation. And at that time, there was a USAID opportunity to create a program on competitiveness. And at that time, we worked with the Vietnamese Chamber of Commerce to create this project, the Provincial Competitiveness Index. That it was really important at the time because a lot of people were trying to determine the Vietnamese, how big the Vietnamese private sector was, how successful it was, what were its issues. And a lot of times people were getting confused between the size of the private sector and good governance. And so we wanted to separate those things. And so we created this index that ranked the provinces based on their business environments, business entry, transparency, corruption, which we called informal charges, land issues. That index has, as Brian was saying, has become a really big deal in Vietnam. It still exists today. It just celebrated its 20th anniversary this week. It's used by government officials. It's part of the Vietnamese cadre promotion system. And it's used by businesses when they're locating investment projects. It's used by business and civil society actors to advocate for change. It's become a really important part of the Vietnamese policy landscape. And I'm really super proud of that. But it also meant that I had this really exciting relationship with the Vietnamese Chamber of Commerce and working with its leadership and some of its young superstar researchers that also has given me a lot of insight into the country. So yeah, as James was saying, when I first got to Vietnam, it was 1997. The U.S. had normalized relationships, but had still not exchanged ambassadors. The way I often think about it is like, when I first got to Vietnam, it took us 2 hours to get from the airport in Hanoi to the city because we kept on getting interrupted by water buffaloes that were crossing the path, and now it's a high-speed highway. People are zipping along. The infrastructure is all really developed. There, you don't see water buffaloes unless you go pretty far ways outside of Hanoi. It really has changed a lot. I also came before the U.S. trade, the U.S. bilateral trade agreement or Vietnam's WTO entry, or the most important law, I think, in Vietnam, which was the enterprise law, which essentially created the legal foundation for the private sector. So at that time, the economy was still dominated predominantly by state-owned enterprises. Mm-hmm. There were just a handful of private companies. Today, there's 800,000 private companies in Vietnam, and some of the biggest, most successful companies in Vietnam, like the Vin Group that makes the VinFast car, are privately held companies. I'll wind up like this little part by just saying that my research has brought me into some other interesting avenues in Vietnam. I started a project with the Vietnamese National Assembly because I wanted to see how governance institutions work and how National Assembly members represented their constituencies. And so we did a long-term 5-year project with them. That was fascinating because it gave me a lot of insight into the Vietnamese policymaking process. And I also worked with UNDP and the Fatherland Front, Vietnam's biggest mass organization, to create Vietnam's first big public opinion survey, which is called the PAPI survey, the Provincial Administrative Performance Survey. So I was sort of doing this just to give you a sense of like the things that I have sort of my eye on and what I'm working on. My current big project that I'm working now on is on Vietnam's green transition, sustainable energy transition, sustainable economic development. And there I'm working with Vin Group, the large Vietnamese conglomerate. And we're working to turn the Vietnam's coastal resort of Nha Trang into Vietnam's first green city. So they have a series of thousands of economic reforms that they've agreed to, and my center is evaluating those reforms.
to the natural next question I have, which is when you compare regimes and when you compare what you've observed with the PCI and your other work on Vietnam to China, how would you say, I mean, both are similar in the sense that they're, one party driven communist leadership in charge, but how would you compare the changes in the way the two regimes sort of operate?
Yeah. So sometimes people say kind of dismissively that Vietnam is 10 years behind China, right? Like they say, okay, here's China. Here's when China started state-owned enterprise reform. Here's when Vietnam started state-owned enterprise reform. Here's when China, entered the WTO in 2001. Vietnam entered in 2007. And then they tend to think of Vietnam kind of as like a little brother of China that had, and they both are single party regimes that are nominally communist, but I think there are some really big differences, and that I think get misunderstood. And so the biggest ones that I like to highlight. So just to highlight, I'll sort of give you three sets of reforms or issues that really make a big difference in the Vietnamese policymaking process. So I think all of you can probably very easily name the most important leader in China. Can you name the top leader in Vietnam? It's a really tricky question, and it's not an easy question, because you could say the general secretary, and that might be right, and over time it has been right. But one thing that differentiates China and Vietnam, and it's really important to understand, is that China has what I call a fused troika, which is that Xi Jinping is the general secretary of the party. He's also the president, right, which allows him to chair the military commission, and the premier is clearly subordinate to him, right? The prime minister of China is clearly subordinate to Xi Jinping. So you don't have a lot of veto points or sort of challenges to authority. In Vietnam, those three positions are all separate positions. So the general secretary is in charge of the party and the party apparatus. The prime minister controls the state apparatus and the bureaucracy. And in fact, state-owned enterprises, he gets to name the head of state-owned enterprises through the Ministry of Finance, and names Provincial People's Committee chairman. And the president is essentially the head of state. Sometimes people say it's a ceremonial role, but it's less ceremonial than people think, because that is the person that is on the military commission and is also gets to appoint ambassadors. So you have these three critical executive roles, all with their own patronage channels and all with the ability to kind of check each other. And so right now in Vietnam, the general secretary is clearly the most important and has consolidated authority, and we can talk about why. But at various times in Vietnamese history, that hasn't been the case always. Sometimes it has been unclear who is the most important actor in the Vietnamese system. Sometimes people have pointed to former prime ministers as the most important actor. So that's number one. And the reason why that's important is I'm just going to like a political economic concept that we often talk about is veto points. The number of people who have the ability to stop policy from going through. So you can think about like the US checks and balances. The more veto points a system has, the more stable policy tends to be, right? So, and that can be good or bad. Sometimes you can say it's gridlock, it's hard to make change. But sometimes that for investors, it means that you can make long-term strategic investments. So Vietnam has more veto points at the elite level, which means that it hasn't been very good always at responding to crises, but it has pretty stable policy environment. And it's not because of this one party system, it's because of this checks at the top. Okay. The second big difference between China that I like to point out to people is like in China, the most important decision-making body is the Politburo Standing Committee, a small group of like 13 people. Xi Jinping obviously chairs it. And that's where all important economic decisions are made. So Vietnam doesn't even have a Politburo Standing Committee. It does have a Politburo, and that is a very important role. But the most important body in Vietnam that makes decisions is the party legislature. We call it the Central Committee. It has about 180 people on it, and provincial representatives make up a little over half of those representatives. And where China makes most decisions, like if you look at party documentation in China and you see party resolutions, you'll see most of them are coming out of the Politburo Standing Committee. The most important resolutions in Vietnam, party resolutions, come from the Central Committee. And so, and in China, the Central Committee meets once a year. In Vietnam, the Central Committee meets at least 2 or 3 times a year, but often meets more, especially when there's major issues going on, like COVID or the Asian financial crisis. The reason why I point out that difference to people is because there's a level of pluralism within the Vietnamese party system that's forced on Vietnam. It's because for Vietnam to move forward with major economic reforms, party leaders need to get the votes of the Central Committee, which means that they need the local leaders who make up almost half those votes. So, and the critical reason why that is so critically important is that about 7 provinces in Vietnam are responsible for about 70% of Vietnam's pre-tax revenue. So Vietnam is highly distorted in terms of the economic power of the country, but even more distorted than China. But when you look at spending of the provinces in Vietnam, spending is far more even across those provinces, and household consumption is far more even. So what has happened in Vietnam is to get economic growth and to move forward with the richer provinces, the poorer provinces needed to be brought along. So Vietnam has a lot more regional transfers to the localities than China has. And so that's why Vietnam's economic growth has been accompanied by such a small rise in economic inequality. Inequality has certainly risen, but Vietnam's Gini coefficient is less than 0.4. Which is really unusual. And the reason has to do with this embedded transfer system that you see in the Vietnamese. The final big institutional difference that matter. Well, I guess I'll just, so another one to highlight that I think that would be important is China does not have direct elections for the National People's Congress. Vietnam has direct elections for the National Assembly. So for China, you vote for your township, and then the township votes for the city level, and the city level votes for the province level. In Vietnam, everybody votes directly for the National Assembly. Now, the National Assembly election is highly managed, right? The Fatherland Front chooses the delegates, but there is competition because the way Vietnam votes is in a block voting. So you're given a list of 5 candidates, and you can vote for 3. So every year in Vietnam, high-ranking people lose elections to the National Assembly. Now, the National Assembly isn't the most important actor in the Vietnamese system, but I often point to that because because politicians actually kind of do care about their electoral returns in the National Assembly. And so you see a level of responsiveness. I don't want to go as far to say Vietnam's a democracy, but you see a level of responsiveness of Vietnamese National Assembly delegates that you don't see in other single-party systems. Final little tidbit that will be important for you to know is in Vietnam, most of the provincial leaders are from the province they lead. Vietnam has a rotation system, but it's at a lower level. So only provincial leaders from the really biggest and most important cities like Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City come from outside. And so that's just another thing to sort of know about, which is often you're dealing with local leaders who are from that province, know about that province, and care about that province deeply in the decisions that they're making, as opposed to China, where they're often just rotating through there for a short time on the way to promotion to higher office.
Great. And you touched on it a little bit, but just in terms of trade, if we could talk about trade a bit, could you put in context, and we certainly don't want you to be on the spot for policy out of Washington, which could change by the minute, but just put some perspective on trade and its role in the economy of Vietnam, both what's critical that it exports, what's critical on the import side, and just maybe provide some perspective on I know that foreign investors sitting here in the U.S., were very attracted to Vietnam conceptually as part of the China +1 strategy, that it would be, even during the first Trump administration when tariff wars began and trade wars began, it seemed like an appropriate place to both produce and then export from there. Could you just kind of provide some perspective on how critical that all is to the economy?
Yeah, I mean, so I think every year there's sort of a ranking of globalization that looks at share of FDI and share of trade over the economy. And Vietnam is like the most globalized country in the world by those metrics. Exports plus imports are 87% of Vietnamese GDP. So 70% of Vietnamese manufacturing exports are produced by foreign companies. And the U.S. is extremely important to Vietnam. So 30% of Vietnam's exports go to the U.S. Vietnam has lifted itself out of poverty with a strategy of export orientation. Like the first foreign investment law in Vietnam was 1987, right? So they have been open to foreign investment. At first it had to be in the form of joint ventures. Now almost 90% of the foreign investors are 100% foreign owned. And Vietnam is a party to numerous trade agreements around the world as a way of promoting trade. So, the biggest reform that happened early in Vietnam was that Vietnam shifted, from a very poor rice importer to one of the country's largest rice exporter. And then over the years, Vietnam's trade has diversified, right? So it was mostly early on sort of commodities driven. Then it moved into low-level production garments. It started to get some assembly. It has since the WTO entry in 2007, and then just like expedited by the Trump tariffs on China in 2018, Vietnam's export portfolio has become really extremely diverse, right? So like as you were mentioning, prior to 2018, a lot of investors had what was called a China plus one strategy. I think of the China plus one strategy as like an insurance contract, right? So I'm going to have most of my supply chain in China, but then if something bad happens, then I can move production to this other location, right? I can increase the number of shifts, maybe expand production a little bit. And in 2018, that happened dramatically as the Trump administration put tariffs on China. You started to see Korean investors, Japanese investors, US investors. Apple negotiated with its Taiwan suppliers to move a large portion of theirs. I think 13 different companies moved into Vietnam for production. Dell has moved production in. So that expanded, and Vietnam's trade with the US like over 250% over that period of time. And also you saw major expansions in electronics, in computer systems as those started to shift. So that's been, I think it's been a really super important part of Vietnam's development strategy. They are highly dependent on trade. That's why there was so much panic on Liberation Day when Trump administration announced 46% tariffs on Vietnam, right? By, I don't mind saying by a very dubious formula that was calculated that since Vietnam's current general secretary has said that he wants Vietnam to grow at over 8% this year, with doubling down on that export-oriented strategy, with the explicit goal of connecting Vietnamese private companies more directly to these foreign supply chains. And so their response was panic as a result of that. As a result of that decision. So that's why one of the first calls that the Trump administration got was from Tô Lâm, the general secretary of Vietnam, offering to bring Vietnam's tariffs, which were already really low on the U.S., like less than 5%, down to zero, right? As a way to try and be part of this negotiation, because Vietnam is not in a position where they can easily shift production to other places. So I'll just add as one issue here that I've become really interested in, and the reason Brian mentioned that I had to testify in front of the Senate, and it was when I had to testify in front of the Senate when this research project was just a glimmer in my eye. I hadn't actually really done what I wanted to do. Was I wanted to actually measure rerouting. So a large group of the investors that have moved in in fact, the largest group that moved into Vietnam was Chinese investors who were opening factories in Vietnam. And And so what you saw was Vietnam's imports from China were going up as its exports to the US were increasing, right? And so I think a lot of armchair economists were saying that must be rerouting, that China's just moving product through Vietnam, sticking a made in Vietnam label on it to avoid certificate of origin or rules of origin, and then shipping to the US. But drawing on aggregate data was in my opinion a major mistake. And the reason why it was a major mistake was because you know, legitimate production is still going to import raw materials and intermediate products from China in order to export. So if I'm going to make bicycles in Vietnam, I still might import bicycle tires from China in order to make those bikes. So that's value added production. That's not rerouting. And I was extremely worried at the time that what would happen, that the Trump administration would take punitive measures calling this rerouting. So what we did was we got customs data from Vietnam at the 8-digit level. So I could see for each company what they were importing and what they were exporting. So I could see if they were importing the same product that they were exporting. And so I could put a finer, with my co-authors, put a finer measure on how much rerouting was taking place. And the answer is that rerouting is taking place, but it's just a little over 10% of the total export activity. 90% of it is what I would call value-added activity, actual production that's creating new products in Vietnam. And so I've tried to, you can see, like I've tried to try and influence this debate, I thought, in some positive ways by trying to help better understand what exactly is going on. I mean, and I think it's important, James, just because the current situation is going to unleash a lot more of exactly this activity, right? So whether it's 145% tariffs on China and 10% on Vietnam, and you're going to see more both value-added and rerouting shifts, or whether we go back to the Liberation Day tariffs and it's 46% in Vietnam and 48% in Cambodia and 38% in Indonesia, you're going to see a lot of this shifting of production. And I think having a better way to measure this and understand this is critical.
Maybe to build on that, the role of these foreign companies operating in Vietnam is a bit of a mixed blessing. I was fascinated to learn from you that when global minimum corporate tax was being discussed, you had said Vietnam would have been the chief beneficiary of that, but that has now gone the wayside, as we know. So could you explain a little bit about corporate taxes and how Vietnam doesn't may actually lose out a little bit from people not corporates not.
Yeah. Sure. So I'm sure like we have all these business leaders online, so I'm sure that all of you know like how transfer pricing works and profit shifting works. And so the issue in Vietnam is that it is so heavily dependent on foreign direct investment, but its corporate income tax is not super high. Like when I first came to Vietnam, it was 30%, got lowered to 25, then 20, and now is like 17%. But it's still higher than Singapore, right? Or higher than Hong Kong, and definitely higher than the Caymans or the Virgin Islands. And so what you see in Vietnam, so the way I make this point to a lot of people is just to say that if you look at Vietnam's total foreign direct investment right now, you will see that of the top 10 foreign investors are 3 tax havens: the Cayman Islands, the US Virgin Islands, and the Seychelles. So why is that? What's happening is companies are declaring those their tax headquarters and then opening up production in Vietnam and then using internal pricing so that they run losses in Vietnam at the 17% corporate income tax, but report profits in the tax havens, right? So, and you can do that. And so that's been an issue in Vietnam across the board. And it's, Korean companies doing it, Taiwanese companies doing it. And I think sometimes when we talk about this, we misunderstand. For a developing country, that type of activity, we think that foreign direct investment is good. Like it's bringing jobs, it's bringing skills, and that's true. And I think Vietnamese officials would 100% agree with that. But the problem is foreign investors also impose lots of costs on the local government. They impose infrastructure costs. They need police protection, fire protection. waste management, and those are costs that need to be paid for. And so where do you get the revenue to generate that when the companies aren't paying the corporate income tax? So Vietnam had this famous fight with Coca-Cola. You can look it up. Coca-Cola applied for an investment expansion. They wanted to expand into new provinces. They said, we've really enjoyed our partnership with Vietnam over the past 2 decades. It's really been great. And Vietnam said, we're really surprised that you want to expand your investment because you've been here 14 years and you've never once declared a profit. And that's because Coca-Cola was able to use transfer pricing. I don't know. I have not looked at the accounts, but I'm sure that the value of Coca-Cola's secret formula is worth a lot, right? So Coca-Cola wasn't paying profits in Vietnam. So that's been an issue. And so Vietnam has been a big fan of the global minimum tax, because that would mean that you would pay 15% tax where your production was, not where your tax haven was. And that would mean that revenue would stay in Vietnam. But short of that, what Vietnam has been doing, so if you talk to foreign investors, and we survey foreign investors, so with a bullet, the most common complaint of foreign investors in Vietnam is tax inspections, because there is a lot of compliance issues. Vietnam is asking them to give spreadsheets about their internal pricing, so Vietnam can see whether their internal pricing in Vietnam is consistent with what they're saying their pricing is in other places. So they can see when you're charging for intermediate goods and saying that this is the arm's length price for that good, like how much is going on. And so as Vietnam's tried to deal with this profit shifting issue, there has been this issue that foreign investors have sort of been frustrated with, which is that it's been a more intrusive investigation into their tax accounts to make sure. And I think that Vietnam would just much have preferred that they didn't have to do their policing on their own, that the global minimum tax would have solved this problem for them.
Could you give your sense over the almost 30 years you've been visiting Vietnam about perceptions among locals of Americans, maybe the different generations? And I was surprised myself in my first trip 2 years ago, how friendly people were to the U.S., to Americans. And of course, there's the War Museum, which is pretty blunt, and it doesn't pull any punches. It definitely shows the horrors of the war. But in your interactions on a daily basis, people are extraordinarily friendly and goodwill. What have you seen that evolve over time and shift over time, or is it what's been?
No, I've had a positive experience with Vietnamese friends and interactions since I first got there in 1997. And this is a question, that I get a lot, and it's an important question. I've tried to explain it this way. So the first thing to remember about Vietnam when you go there is that you're going to find, and I'm going to get this number wrong, but it's close to 85% were born after the war and have no memory of the war at all, right? So you're going to deal with a large group of young people for whom America has been an aspiration, right? Like they have had. This is a generation that was born after the strict years of central planning in Vietnam, and that generation and the younger generations are very different from their parents in the sense that they've grown up in a very globalized, very open Vietnam, and where the US and Western countries have been more of an aspiration than an enemy. So that's the first thing to sort of keep in mind. I think the second thing is like the way Vietnamese people tend to think of the war or that period is like, we can't be enemies with everybody, right? Like, so remember, Vietnam was essentially a Chinese colony for 1,000 years, a French colony for 100. Right? They had negative interactions with the Japanese during World War II, right? And then relatively not exactly positive interactions in terms of its participation in Comecon with the Soviet Union. They fought a war with Cambodia. So Vietnam has often sort of positioned itself as like the sort of we now want to be friends with the world. We don't want, we're not like they have, sometimes people call it bamboo diplomacy, but an idea of sort of not choosing sides in the strategy. And I think the US is part of a long history of an independence war, but not the only piece of that history. When we are as Americans, we think of it as this is the American war, but Vietnam thinks of it starts with the first Indochina War and the independence movement, and thinks of the second Indochina War, the US war, as a continuation of that first war. I just like the way it's taught in history books. And that's not to say that there are, of course, policymakers in Vietnam who are wary of the US. That exists. There was a concept called peaceful evolution. We call it constructive engagement, right? Which is like, remember the Bill Clinton strategy, like through trade and investment, that country will import our values. And when our values, then we'll move closer together. So like Vietnam has the same concept. They call it peaceful evolution, which kind of sounds like a nice name, but it's not nice in that it means that we understand that through trade that you're trying to change Vietnamese core values. So there's wariness and an idea, and definitely a view that the Vietnam's a country that doesn't want to have to be made to take sides, right? I think right now in this current policy debate, there's a lot of policymakers who sort of envision Southeast Asia as part of like a grand game, but the Southeast Asian countries don't see it that way. They see we have a relationship with China and a dependence on China for certain activities and a dependence on the US. And their best goal is to continue to triangulate within that space, right? So I think that's what I'd be. But I think people will treat you with enormous respect, and will be excited that you're from the U.S. and have an understanding of the U.S. as a partner and as Vietnam's friend. Whenever U.S. presidents come to Vietnam, the streets are packed. For Obama, for Clinton, for Trump, right? Like there is an admiration and a appreciation for what the U.S. has done.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.